After all this, you still...
I still want that gas, yes. And you had better deliver.
All right. I put the outline up, so we got it. Oh, great. So I just found out that you have sound effects in Discord now?
Yeah, I was gonna say, where's the clapping coming from?
Let's see, we have the quack, air horn. Oh, I'm gonna configure a whole soundboard in here. Oh, I'm ready to be on my producer shit now. Welcome back to the greenhouse, everyone. It's me and Josh today. We're gonna be covering something that's been dominating the political news as of late. I guess whatever I had planned to discuss in this podcast when I started out, what a lot of our regular coverage has become, and I don't hate this, right? But I think we're in this rotating cast of trying to read the tea leaves of the different branches of the U.S. government. And today we're going to be talking about the courts, or more specifically, some of the controversy embroiling Supreme Court Justice.
The latest high-tech lynching of one of America's great heroes.
Man. You know, it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's exactly what he said during the Anita Hill hearings.
Well, it was deliberate that I said that. It was supposed to be an in-joke.
I mean, that's a deep cut in Clarence Thomas hating circles. But I mean, what's going on with this particular case, right, is I'm feeling somewhat vindicated. And when I say I feel vindicated, I don't feel good. It's more just of like, oh God, I'm right. But I think, you know, when you have some of these discussions with people about the supposed neutrality of the court and this idea that the Supreme Court justices act with impartiality or with principle, you know, it's somewhat frustrating to deal with that. It can kind of lead you to be talking to a wall sometimes. And what we're seeing here today kind of confirms all my priors that, like, no, you know, the game's fishy, to say the least.
Yeah, well, you know, ironically, you know, timely enough, again, I'm actually talking about, I talked about Congress and the courts today. I did ask them how they feel about, my students, how they felt about trust in the courts and whatnot. And, you know, there's this ongoing sense of like that's shrinking every year. And that was largely the case here. The most positive thing someone had to say, and it's possible others had more positive views, but they, you know, just didn't share them. But someone said that he trusted the courts more than the elected bodies because he feels that that's like a more genuine expression of who they are, which he had said it in a way that was like really backhanded, right? So it's like, oh, I trust that, like, you know, they'll decide, you know, that like I know what outcome I'm going to get from them, like right or wrong. And yeah, I mean, that's the courts, right? I mean, it's about as political. They don't have electoral incentives, which, I mean, I think is problematic in different ways than what was expressed by that student. But, you know, this is the latest and greatest. Though I guess there's also that circuit court ruling out of Texas on the abortion pill. Its name is escaping me at the moment, but that's another thing that's happening like at the same time with, you know, just mass judicial illegitimization.
That's a sticking point that I think it's maybe worth addressing, right? With this Texas ruling, right, we're kind of in a weird, like, I wouldn't call it crisis, but just like, okay, where does the federalism apply with this ruling? Because you had, what was it? Was it the Illinois governor or the Minnesota governor basically saying, how about no?
Yeah, it was. I want to say it was Illinois, but it could be. I think it was one. It was one of them. Yeah.
And I think like this is a sticking point that I've had to. It's come up in discussions I've had with folks a couple times where, like, if you mention that the courts are kind of the most undemocratic branch of our government, at a federal level, let's just say, the alternative that always gets brought up is like, well, I mean, look at the cases in which they are elected. Like, wouldn't that play a role in their impartiality or lack thereof? And this, like, I'd say, like, the degree of faith someone has in the courts is once again, dictated by their existing level of faith in civic religion. But I was thinking about this earlier today. I wanted to maybe run this by you as a supplement to our usual thesis, right? Is like,
Sure.
I guess, this hackneyed idea of American exceptionalism once again comes into play, where like you can only really believe all this if you believe that America and its institutions are not subject to what in the rest of the world would look like a, pretty clear-cut corruption case, right?
Yeah, I mean I think that's definitely something that happens, and certainly we charge other countries with corruption cases on similar or lesser grounds. And I mean, and even just domestically, right? I mean, you hear the right really rant and rave about George Soros at every given opportunity, yet this is sort of getting like, it's just friends, just one friend who has, billions of dollars helping a brother out, and it's, there's, that hypocrisy. And I think there's been, debate over whether or not confronting hypocrisy really matters. I think it's more so kind of maybe self-performative.
Yeah.
In some ways, right? More than it is persuasive for other people. But yeah, I mean, like, I think you're right to say that in general that it sort of ties into, that broader notion of like you buy into it based on like, where you find yourself in society. I mean, if you agree with them more often than not, you're fine. The American exceptionalism, the fact that we kind of, in some ways, don't really look close to home when it suits our needs. We do when it doesn't, but for the most part we kind of just ignore a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, and this is, I don't know if this is directly related, right? But in some of the Obama era discussions about money in politics, right? I think one of the criticisms of the side that wants money out of politics, even though I think that can kind of be a reductive solution at times, right? Is that, sure, well, you have to prove there was a quid pro quo. And it's like, sometimes like my initial view on this sometimes is like, if two things can be correlated, that alone is suspicious. But also just calling it out like that in the way they did puts this like unnecessary burden of proof on people who want to bring truth to power, or like try to bring things out into the open, where it's like, well, you have to prove they were influenced, and it's like, how do you?
Well, and not even just that. Like, I think for the most part, I think people arguing like the money out of politics, which, I mean, as you said, like, it's an inelegant solution, especially if it's like, well, what happens to people who are just inherently more wealthy or whatever,
right?
But like they're not suggesting, for the vast majority of the time, like criminal punishment for any of these things, right? I mean, they're just asking for like, usually when it's brought up money in politics, they're talking about campaigns, which doesn't apply to the courts, or at least these courts. And the reason with that is like, they're trying to sort of, sorry, brain fire on that. But, the point is like, they're not trying to like say that these people are criminally liable. They're trying to say that, we want to prevent this influx of money having any type of influence, right? Whether or not it's a perceived or an actual one. It's not really about, prosecuting people for receiving too much money. Maybe it's, them forfeiting their office. And, occasionally when we have more egregious violations, then yeah, we can have some criminality here. And certainly there's some calls. I don't know how widespread they are, but for like impeachment of someone like Clarence Thomas's stature in this case. But it's kind of a separate issue.
Yeah, like functionally, the quid pro quo rule that like you get from conservatives kind of translates to me like not only do you have to prove the financial linkages, which in some cases are sometimes out in the open, right? You then have to find like documentation that someone's mind was changed. And
Sure.
that's, how do you even begin
Well,
to, fight that? I don't know.
Well, then the scholarly argument generally is when it comes to money and politics, and I think that that's kind of what's being argued with here as well, is like, do I buy that Clarence Thomas's mind has changed in terms of like the way he would actually rule on a case being different? Not really, right? I think that he's most likely going to side with this guy on cases regardless. It just fits with his, his personal jurisprudence and his ideology. But there are certain things, especially in the case of Clarence Thomas, where, it's been pointed out several times, him not recusing himself from a number of cases, the most notable of which have involved, like, his wife in January 6th. But, cases that might have involved this guy as well, or others, where he should have recused himself and didn't. And yeah, he's decided, like, every case that this guy has been, like, someone that was, like, on the case, a brief or whatever, or an organization that tied the amicus brief. It's all stuff that is, he's decided in this guy's favor every time. Whether or not it's because he's gotten that money or not, kind of is inconsequential, right? We argue generally, even in campaigns, that for the most part, people are giving money to people that already agree with them. And I'm not really challenging that notion. Maybe I certainly agree with it probably most of the time anyways. But I think, in this particular case as well, it's just, the influence doesn't matter. It's like sort of, I think people are even bothered by the sense that you're like rewarding someone for questionable behavior in general, right? And like this, it creates a system of enfranchisement where the people who already think a certain way kind of already have like this buy-in, right? Like Clarence Thomas is able to sort of coast through, the judicial system and remain there for years because he, had the right views to begin with. Or, maybe, some stuff was changed by him recognizing, strategically that like, hey, a black man doing a white man's, grift that has, its own potential. Let's tap into that.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, where it's like, we have this very nebulous public understanding of what corruption is. Like, we all can point to what we deem to be corruption and we can say that it's bad unequivocally, but then finding like the standard for it is dicey, especially in our system that tends to, I mean, I'll say it like it is, right? Is that it does benefit people like Clarence Thomas's buddy Harlan Crow.
Yeah.
More so than it does someone who donated $27 to Bernie, you know what I mean? So let's get into the specific charge at play here. And this is the kind of thing where I'm citing Wikipedia here, not because I prefer it, simply to keep things simple.
It's honestly, it's a great synthesis of this information a lot of times.
Sometimes it is, exactly. So the specific case here, in 2023, ProPublica reported that Crow has given several gifts to Associate Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, including a $19,000 Bible that belonged to Frederick Douglass, a portrait of the justice and his wife. Tax filings also show that Crow's foundation gave $105,000 to Yale Law School, Thomas's alma mater, even though Thomas has been on record saying he regretted ever going. That's funny. The key point that's egregious is he had accepted numerous week-long luxury trips, including island hopping on Crow's super yacht, international and domestic private jet travel, private resort stays. One of the more spicy examples was also Clarence Thomas being invited to what's the grove that all the billionaires go hang out at with the big owl?
Oh, gosh, I just had it too. I can't remember.
Bohemian Grove, exactly.
Yes.
Like it's just like the popular example of rich guys like conspiring in secret. That's where Clarence Thomas was. You know, it's almost comical if it wasn't like, you know, somewhat startling, right? And specifically why, aside from maybe my ideological biases deeming this bad, the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 passed after Watergate, and the law requires that justices, judges, members of Congress, and federal officials must disclose most gifts. These rules were clarified and updated in March 2023, but still allow exceptions to the reporting rules if a gift of food, lodging, or entertainment is deemed personal in nature, and the hospitality has been directly offered by an individual who has personal relationship to the official in question. The new rules do, however, require disclosure of stays at commercial properties as well as private jet travel. And that's the sticking point here is like, yeah, there's several violations of that act here.
Right, yeah, and I've seen a lot of people kind of just defend it, like, well, you know, it's like he's just a friend, he's just hanging out with a friend. It's like, well, like, this friendship conveniently started, you know, within the past 25 years, well after Clarence Thomas was appointed to the court and confirmed to the Supreme Court. Obviously, you know, post-Watergate, that's the era Clarence Thomas was, you know, is sworn into, right? It's not like he is someone who just happened to, you know, like, well, he's old, he just forgot. Like, it's like, no, this has always been the case during his entire tenure, at least on the Supreme Court. I can't remember what he was doing before that. I know a lot of justices are typically circuit court judges. I don't necessarily recall if he was or not. But it's inconsequential, right? I mean, it's
Bork or something like that, something weird like that. I'll take a look.
Gosh, yeah, just why not just go for the circular Federal Society loop? Actually, you should go back up to the top of this page.
Let's see.
District Court of Columbia Appeals.
Yeah, Homework
that wasn't
Bush.
Much longer before, though.
Yeah, Homework Bush nominated him to the D.C. Circuit following Bork's departure. Okay, so that's the Bork linkage.
And that's immediately preceding his Supreme Court nomination, because that's also under Bush. What was he before that?
Before that, Assistant Secretary of Education for the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education on May 1981.
What do you think his stance on CRT is?
I'm kind of realizing like there's indeed a limit to what me and you can comment on in some of these cases, and like I think there is a discussion that needs to be had on like how conservatism manifests in different parts of the United States as a regional phenomenon, and also like culturally, right? Like I think when we have been talking about conservatives, we've mostly been talking about suburban whites. How it manifests, you know, in the Black political tradition is its own thing, not really well understood by the mainstream. Some recent phenomenons like Trump's popularity with like Latinos is also like,
well, and God, you had that where was that? I saw it this morning where there's the black state representative who just went on like the most like xenophobic trans rant I've ever heard. Gosh, who was it?
I recall what you're saying. I think it was some state senator. I know it was trending earlier.
Yeah, I can't remember where he's from, but yeah, like he just went like hard on him, and you know, like just how much of a proud Christian conservative Republican he is and whatnot. And it's like you get like, I mean, you wouldn't even expect maybe that like some of the African Americans that you get that are more conservative, you would think that they would tend maybe to skew a little bit more moderate, just with our general like preconceptions about that, you know, ethnic group. But that's not the case. Not always the case.
I don't know, because I was reading up on Clarence Thomas before this one, and like I saw that he was influenced by both Thomas Sowell and Ayn Rand, and Ayn Rand is just the brain killer in my opinion, right? But you could argue her work is somewhat neutral of race. Thomas Sowell, I keep seeing him like, how like when you're on YouTube and every time like you watch something of like a not even necessarily like left wing persuasion, you might have just like watched a Daily Show clip or like a
Sure.
CNN, God forbid, and then like Thomas Sowell will come up as like a recommended video, and from what I could tell is that he was some kind of black conservative economist. I don't necessarily understand everything about his work, and black conservatism as a whole is one of those things that like I don't have a working knowledge of, so I'm not going to comment too hard. But it might be worth going into with someone who's more well versed in a future episode, or just something maybe to pick up on, because not to humanize the American conservative movement, but it's not really it's not a monolith. It's a very complex beast, to say the least.
Yeah, and like it's really kind of understanding the different motivations too. I mean, I think a lot of them have like very similar prescriptive interest for government and whatnot, right? Where like, or they believe that's either a certain problem, but like there's disagreements really over like kind of what core problems are and how they should be solved. Most of them would argue the private sector and like very little in the public sector, but there's generally that like consensus of like shrinking the scope of government in a number of key areas. But you're right, it's not totally monolithic. There's some nuance that does get lost.
Right, and maybe tying us back to where we were when we started, right? Is that like how do these various constituencies of the American right come to interact, right? Because we can kind of maybe get into Thomas's own background as like someone coming up in the 70s as an attorney, finding the new intellectual strain of the right, which is this libertarian push. Yeah. Crow himself, who's also the other party in this story, right? Founding member of the Club for Growth, served on the board of the American Enterprise Institute, has donated almost $5 million to Republican campaigns and conservative groups, and is, when we bring up the Bohemian Grove connection, he is a member of that club. You know what I mean? So he's like sending out the invites for this secret meeting. So it's this is one of those things where it's like I don't necessarily have the language for this, other than like there's very selective lenses applied to how we talk about collusion, particularly along class lines. We often have conspiracy theory as like the stand-in for addressing it. Maybe parapolitics if you're like, savvy to a certain lens. But very broadly, like, I think there's this culture of like deeming it somewhat impolite to bring up these connections at best, and outright dismissing them at worst, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, you're right. It's a coping mechanism probably more than anything.
God damn it, it's all cope. It's cope all the way down. But it's again, it's like, there's a reason why I brought up that quid pro quo principle. Like, what it does is like it kind of puts you in like the prostrate position every time you try to bring up these connections. So there's this like unnecessarily high burden of proof, because now you have to prove someone's mind was changed. That's an incredibly subjective thing. How do you prove that? And also, like, like there's a combination of self-doubt and maybe like poor presentation style will lead you to look like that Charlie Day meme in front of the whiteboard. But at the same time, like, this is not necessarily hardball journalism me and you are doing here. This is existing reporting that is pretty solidly backed at this point. And these are connections that, you know, are worth looking into, even if you can't say that, oh, Clarence Thomas had his mind changed. The fact that he's associating with people with inordinate amounts of power is something that I think, needs to be addressed. It calls into question the integrity of the system that we say can't be changed,
Well, yeah, and I think it raises these integrity questions in some ways, like maybe in this kind of just barely beneath the surface style way, right? And what I mean by that is, we might consider that, even if it's not corruption, right? It's just the fact that it creates this appearance, right? That there's this appearance of bias, and then that's kind of problematic. I mean, I'm not one of those guys like Chief Justice Roberts, who's very much like, the court's only corrupt if you say it's corrupt, basically. If you acknowledge it, then that's the delegitimization of it, not the actual acts that are the problem, right? And it creates this appearance, right? If this is someone he's associating with, and we haven't gotten to the real juicy details about Harlan Crow, which is his historical collections. In particular, his apparently vast collection of Nazi memorabilia that he has. Apparently, this has been sort of like, I guess, an open secret with people who have like been affiliated with him or have encountered him. There was one report that I saw, kind of collaborating that, where they said that they were there for that was posted by a socio-technical researcher, Dana Boyd, and she had noted that she had gone there for, of all things, a meeting about the future of democracy at his house, which is like, I mean, if you have a collection of Nazi memorabilia, I think your thoughts on the future democracy are spoken for in a lot of ways.
No, that's it needs no further contradiction from me. Let's maybe get into some of those items in that collection, right? So, out of order, Crow's Dallas residence is a home to an extensive collection of Nazi memorabilia, including 2 paintings by Hitler. That's like a leg up from having a George Bush painting. Wow.
Yeah.
And a signed copy of Mein
painted them.
And he has a signed copy of Mein Kampf. His private library contains a collection of 8,500 books and manuscripts, including historical documents from Juan Ponce de Leon, Christopher Columbus, Amerigo Vespucci, George Washington, Robert E. Lee, and all the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Additional items also include Napoleon's writing desk and the Duke of Wellington's sword from 1815.
Like, some of these, right, are just kind of like rich douchebag can just like buy up all these historical artifacts that, belong in a museum, right?
Some of it is that, but then it's like, what the ideological inconsistency is not being pointed out in the press, mainly because it should be self-evident. But yeah, let's get into the inconsistency here, because we mentioned the Nazi artifacts. We also mentioned, again, having Juan Ponce de Leon and like Columbus and Vespucci, as well as Washington and Lee, is like, oh, this is some Manifest Destiny bullshit.
Yeah, like, I mean, the Columbus Washington like Declaration of Independence signatories, right? That's kind of just like, well, like American patriot, like civic religion type stuff, right? Robert E. Lee, raises some eyebrows, but like, we haven't totally, canceled the Confederacy yet in the year 2023. Does raise, but like, it's like, whatever. Like, you don't, from a point of ignorance, you can maybe tolerate some of that. The Nazi stuff and some of the other things, yeah, that's a little suspect. You've also got this, the Garden of Evil.
Exactly.
Which has like these statues of authoritarian leaders. Not Hitler, by the way.
Yeah, specifically the leaders in question here. So like, we've got Lenin, Stalin, Castro, Zedong, we got Mao. God, how did I fuck that up? We got Marx in there. Marx was not even a politician; he was a theorist.
Right.
Hosni Mubarak, not even part of the same ideological movement as the prior. Tito at least makes some sense. I don't know how to say Nicolae Ceausescu's last name. I know he was the Romanian communist leader.
Yeah.
We got Walter Ulbricht, who was in the one of the founders of the KPD. Gavrilo Princip, again, has nothing to do with the communist movement, as far as I understand. Bela Kun, who was a Hungarian revolutionary, and then Che Guevara. So it still doesn't add up. He says that he acquired these former public monuments after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Cool, so you stole something while the government was being torn
right.
down.
Yeah,
Nice.
it's straight up just colonial expeditionalism, right? And to get this, well, and I guess Princip. I mean, is it like that? I'm wondering, like, it's like the through line that all of these have, like, even beyond just, like whatever their ideology is, they're all kind of anti-monarchist. I mean,
Mubarak, I don't even understand.
Princip's really principled. I mean, he just killed, he killed Franz Ferdinand. So like that's I guess the only thing I can think of where it's like, well, I mean, I don't know if it was necessarily ideologically motivated. I'll admit I have never really studied him in particular detail.
Yeah, it's like I don't know, because like from what I understood, at least from taking AP European history, so I'm not an expert. Princip seemed like more like of a nationalist of that age than anything else.
Yeah.
Mubarak also doesn't add up. Like I don't know what his role in any of this is.
Hey, dude, this just happened to be the stuff he could steal. Okay,
right?
Like
right.
it's, but the fact of the matter is, it's like you have this garden of evil, and then you have Nazi stuff that's kept separate, kept in a point of privilege, right?
Right.
And
so,
like the defense for this that has come from the right, is that like a lot of people and like all these people, it's been kind of like discussed, and it's not even, it doesn't even require really deep investigative journalism to discover, because a lot of them are relatively open about it, right? They are his also friends and fellow beneficiaries.
Exactly.
There's people who are already benefiting from this relationship with him. So, of course, they'll defend him. So their argument is like, well, you want to keep stuff that you hate. Which apparently means I've been doing collecting all wrong.
That's what we do on Twitter. That's what we do on Twitter. We're collecting things we hate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have like a file or anything of it, but I just usually my collection is I scroll past it and I probably remember it for the stuff that I hate. But yeah, I mean, like the thing is that notion is just bullshit, right? Like the fact that you collect things that you hate to remind you of how much you hate them. I mean, that's like people stalking their ex,
pretty much
type of behavior, right? Like that's just really weird and bizarre. And I don't buy it, right? Who has a fucking owned copy of Mein Kampf? And is like, well, it's because I really hate Hitler. Like, in that case, like, shouldn't like the Holocaust History Museum or all these Holocaust memorials, shouldn't they just have like a proud like statue of Adolf Hitler or a swastika all over it, because it's you want to remember what you hate?
Well, and that's the thing, right? Is like, no, they correctly determined, no, you build the monument in response to everyone who was unfairly, their lives were lost. So, yeah. and specifically, the intellectual fig leaf from Crow, he says he collects such memorabilia because he hates communism and fascism. And that's the line here that like keeps coming up, I brought this up in past episodes of the podcast. It's probably something that's worth addressing. It's like, regardless of your view of various communist projects, and like your position on U.S. foreign policy, I think it's intellectually lazy at best and malicious at worst to compare those projects to fascism just because you find them aesthetically similar or you were told that in school or what have you. There's incredibly different things happening in history in both those cases. And in the cases where, I'll be very frank, right? Like, I would say that the global struggle for communism did more good than any of the fascist movements ever did in any of their missteps. You know what I mean? But, whether the American right does this intentionally or unintentionally, they have become very effective at understanding that, American pop history and American pop culture understands the Nazis as bad correctly and with very little convincing. Even with like a resurgent far right on the rise, Nazis are very easy to use in media as like a stock villain because they are irredeemable.
Mm-hmm.
But then I think like one of the brilliant things the American right has devised in its various attempts to stifle the lefts domestically and abroad is equating communism with fascism, point blank.
100%, yeah.
And again, like it should be these things have to be called into question. Where again, Harlan Crow, wealthy and influential guy, highly involved in several avenues of not just elite gatherings, but also conservative policy making and political priority setting, is also involved in this like project of intellectual laziness and malfeasance, and is also, whether or not he has influence over Clarence Thomas is one thing. The fact that he's buddy with a member of the Supreme Court, and this isn't called into attention until like 20 years later, should be worrying.
100%, yeah. As I said, the influence doesn't necessarily. I mean, like the influence is there regardless, right? I mean, like whatever is said on the show while I'm here. Generally, it's like whether or not I like 100% agree with it or not. I mean, it's like this is the association. This is like we're both influenced kind of by each other through association, and that's without millions of dollars kind of at play.
Right.
It's like whatever types of things you kind of associate with him, it's like, and the thing is, Clarence Thomas would never outright denounce any of this, right? He would just sort of call it another lynching or whatever, whatever type of vile thing he can associate with it, not the act itself that he committed, but just the criticism of it, because naturally just criticizing someone in a public space is obviously tantamount to the types of racial discrimination that people would face in the South, right? I mean, it's 1-to-1 comparison. Yeah, and it's just like a ton of intellectual dishonesty, I think, on display here all around. It's amusing seeing Ben Shapiro have to go out to bat for a Nazi.
I mean, this article you shared from
there's
the
nothing
Lever,
there's nothing to their intellectual rigor anymore. It's gone, if it was ever there.
100%. I think we've talked about like the intellectual heavyweights in the right versus like this kind of, well, fuck it, we don't need a justification, we'll act without it. And I think like here we are once again, even in the space where it is. I mean, you could argue the courts is the space for the nerds and they have to hide it with intellectual fig leaves, but here we are again. And like this article you sent me from the Lever, where many of the pundits who are coming forward to defend both Harlan Crow and Clarence Thomas are kind of being paid by Thomas here too.
Yeah,
or not by Thomas, by Crow actually.
Yeah.
So it's once again like we're in like meme politics territory where it's like,
well, this is class solidarity, right? We don't. Everyone said we don't have it in America. Here it is. Here's your class solidarity.
But we talk about class warfare. Here it is. Oh God!
An attack on one is an attack against them all.
It's okay. We don't have corruption in the United States. We have lobbying. Oh, dear God! Any other country, you hear a report about it, we got boots on the ground, we got CIA ready to destabilize. When it happens here, well, maybe the left is overreacting here.
I don't even think you can say that. I mean, any like legitimate left, like in terms of like empowered, uh, supposedly leftist individuals, they are asleep at the wheel at best. We've seen Dick Durbin, what is he, the Judiciary Chair right
Yeah.
now, shirking. I think he might get bullied into actually doing something, but just calling on John Roberts to launch an internal investigation, which worked out great for the Dobbs leak. Um, you know, in great fact finding there, really nailed it in terms of finding out who was responsible for that. But you had, and kind of another point too, and just in terms of their like poor handle on the judiciary, is you have good old Dianne Feinstein,
Oh yeah.
who apparently has missed 58 Senate votes in the last month because of illness. Which is this played a direct role in their ability to actually confirm federal judges and whatnot, because if Dems don't have all of the Dems present in the Judiciary Committee, they have to get like a discharge petition, all that wonderful stuff to actually get people out. But because we thought it was a wonderful idea to put an 89-year-old on the Judiciary Committee, we are now beholden to her personal health in terms of any level of judicial control or even just judicial accountability.
It's, I mean, not to bring back something I was saying last year, but I mean, here we are again, right? Where it's like every little fundraising email you're forced to look at, every like thing that's beaten over your head in political coverage and op-eds of like, it doesn't. It's almost like they're saying it doesn't matter if we don't do our job. You want your rights that are hanging by like the most threadbare statutes to continue to exist for another year. If you have to vote for this, you have to vote for somebody who doesn't even know where they are. This is I mean it's criminal how they can get away with this almost, and especially like for anything to even function in when it comes to this issue, right? If you have a key vote who's not present, what are you doing? What opposition are you running to a supposed resurgence of Trump? Where's this fundraising money going? I'm not trying to raise another alarm here, but it's like what is this what is all this sound and fury signifying nothing for?
Yeah, I mean that's the greater mystery, right? It's yeah, I don't know. I mean, you just really wonder like what are we trying to accomplish here if we we're raising money for campaigns, and I'm not just trying to like. I mean, I guess I still nominally believe in like the electoral process and whatnot.
I'm not saying
voting
like,
and stuff like that, but it's like you look at the results that they're sort of presenting you with, and you really kind of wonder like, well, what is going on? Why are like the whole vote blue no matter who thing, and I don't know if that was an elite generated thing or like I've seen a lot of cringy things from campaign organizers. It wouldn't shock me if they were just like, yeah, like this is catchy, let's stick with it. But like again, like it's something like Dianne Feinstein, and she's in California. Like you're telling me you couldn't find someone like just like even not even necessarily ideologically to the left of her, just someone who was like conscious.
Who's 30 years younger? That's all you
30
need.
years younger.
That's
like
all you need.
You can't find anyone. That's absurd.
This is I think once again like there is a Kristen Cinema effect here where it's like someone's own reticence to do the right thing or just like have a stance on something can be traded up for cash or influence. But then in this case, like I don't know who this benefits. Like there's a lot of power to be had in a US Senate seat on the Judiciary Committee, and like
Yeah.
to have it basically kind of wasted like this is criminal. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the best
This
way
is
to
an
put
angle
it.
I didn't even consider. Dear God.
Well, I mean, we just kind of got that story. Like, I mean, obviously, like, 58 days. I mean, that tracker's been, sliding or whatever. But like, that was something I just was like brought to my attention, and like, it's so weird because, and I alluded to this at the top of the show that like I cover some current events in class and whatnot, and like lately it's been like eerily timely, where it's like, oh hey, like Clarence Thomas, I'm going to be talking about that literally the day before we're going to talk about like judicial politics, the Congress's ability to check it, judicial legitimacy at large, and things like that. And then even better, I mean, I talked about this with the Trump one, but like literally talking about like, well, he's set to be arraigned literally as I am speaking to you right now. Like it's a really bizarre time in American politics and like that in that like very specific, very personal way for me. Uh, but I mean, yeah, it's like the whole thing is just problematic. Where it's like we have people who I don't know if that they're fundamentally unserious about wielding power in a way that actually achieves objectives, and that they're just so obsessed with process that they just don't care, or if it is like just this is just the best they can do, which is possibly even more disturbing.
And this is why, like, I had to give our this little disclaimer at the start of like what we kind of do is reading the tea leaves at this point, because like this is stuff that is beyond the imagination to begin with. Like in the most like in the upper house of a legislative body in a country, let alone one as powerful as the United States. There's a seat being occupied by someone who is incapable of fulfilling the duties of their office by virtue of old age. And like because of the way our parties are structured, they can't be ousted. Because of the way things are run in the state, it would be too hard to get a vote of no confidence or like a removal from office. Because of the amount of programming we've done on ourselves about how the system's supposed to work, you can't just be like, okay, let's get grandma out of here and let's just put someone in the seat. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's astonishing, and like I was mentioning with everything else before, it's like this system has been comically put under new stresses by the day that the constitutional order was not designed to account for, nor could it have accounted for accounting for. And what's ironic to me in all of this, right, is like my idea that like, well, the system by design supports and enables bourgeois rule still remains to be true, even in cases of misconduct and just not even like running, not even being at the wheel. The machine handles it somehow.
Yeah, and it's in some ways I don't think that the bourgeois rule enabled by this was never I don't think it was ever fathomed that it would get to like this level. Both of just like the level of depravity and also just the level of wealth at play. I mean, the one thing that's like probably not surprising about this, I mean, I just said like like it's as unimaginable as a lot of this is. The one thing that's probably really consistent here is that Clarence Thomas is a piece of shit. Like that's the one thing in the at least that we've kind of gone through here that's like not shocking in the slightest.
Again, Clarence Thomas being appointed to the court is one of those enduring acts of evil that the Bush family has left on the country years after leaving office. Homework Bush was on one, man. He was, again, just like there was no way to address this before, but like there's something very malicious about like, oh, Thurgood Marshall's retiring. Let's just ratchet up the contradictions and find a black conservative to replace the office.
Yeah, I mean it's, and as much as all that hoopla was made over the supposed affirmative action in Biden appointing Ketanji Brown Jackson to the court.
Right.
I mean, Reagan, when he ran for office, said he would appoint a woman. We got Sandra Day O'Connor. Thurgood Marshall, the first black man on the court, is replaced by another black man. And it's one about as far from him politically and ideologically as possible.
And I think again, like, this does speak to the project of what I'll call the judicial right, where it's like we have a litany of conservative like justices at the ready, nurtured and groomed by various fronts like the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, you name it, right? To staff any office as soon as it's open. And Clarence Thomas arguably was, one of the early people in that line, right? But what this project has always served to do is to, in addition to trying to ban abortion, and in addition to prevent anything good from happening, is to maintain this kind of order. And his own philosophy of being a textual originalist is like the salient point in all of this. That this is all happening for a guy who believes the system fundamentally does not need to be changed. In fact, changing it is immoral in some way.
Yeah, I mean, that is really. Yeah, I was going to say that really is the core argument from the textual originalist, right? That changing the system in any way is immoral. Which I don't know how you manage to sell that to anyone who's not like just ludicrously enfranchised by the status quo. They somehow manage it. I have no idea how. I would like to have that power someday. I don't think it'll ever come, but
I don't know if I need that power. Like, if you have that power, you are not you at the end of it. I don't know. It's bizarre. I'm speechless, man.
Yeah, and that's just. I mean, that's a broader topic for like another episode down the line. Maybe it's just on like. Just a weird, like, jurisprudential fascination with, originalism and stuff like that. And I don't know. I mean, it's, I don't even think that he truly believes in it. Scalia, sort of the his intellectual senpai, if you will, on the that front. I mean, like. These are the same folks who, basically created gun rights as we know it with DC versus Keller. I mean, that was more or less, it bears all the trappings of the supposed judicial activism that they are so angry that the left engages with. And this is kind of like a broader topic too with, when it comes to what's derided as judicial activism, it's like, they use it initially to kind of get you of stuff that's maybe a little bit more contentious, right? Like abortion, other stuff where like, it's, there's a decent divide in how the country views it, though that's no longer really the case for abortion, a lot of other issues. But they also, when they talk about it, they ostensibly mean stuff like Brown v. Board of Education, right? And like all these other things where it's like, wait a minute, like, this is stuff that like is kind of universally seen as good by most people, and you're trying to argue that it's actually a moral affront to our constitutional system, which, I mean, maybe this is just my own like civic religiosity coming through or whatever. But it's like, I'd like to think at least a good chunk of the framers or founders would have wanted the system to adapt to fit more modern morals over time. I mean, that certainly is the arguments that come through in like the Federalist Papers and all the stuff that they're writing at the time of its inception. Yet we have this really kind of just bizarre prevailing theory that some people in the judiciary have.
Yeah, and like I think in addition to what you mentioned, like it may be worth just examining like the Great Society era of American liberalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think like, both me and you prior to maybe coming into this leftist lens that we've come into now, right? Like I'd say that like when you self-identified as a progressive back in 2014 or whatever, and you're retweeting all the stupid Teddy Roosevelt posts, you're talking about LBJ. Of course, you're ignoring things like foreign policy, the wars,
Of course,
American
yeah.
imperialism, because by perspective, you're blinded by that. But at the same time, right, like Great Society liberalism is a project that had a real vision for like trying to reconcile the contradictions of the American state with its supposed founding ideals, while also trying to be this kind of alternative to the communist world. We could argue how effective it was. We could argue about, was it dismantled or was it unsustainable? That's not really stuff I'm qualified to
Or just
speak.
willfully unsustained.
Right. There's also that angle to it, and this is an era of history that I'm interested in, but I don't have a lot of background knowledge on. Right, but like I would say that like any humanistic or any positive qualities of American liberalism come out of that tradition to some extent, and I think with the Clinton era, we have a kind of posturing to the good vibes, but none of that vision. Even Obama era liberalism had none of those aspects. Obama himself famously said that I believe in American exceptionalism. So, it's to that end that like we mentioned the 70s and the era that Clarence Thomas is coming up in, and also just H.W. Bush himself post Watergate. This is like the Republican project to dismantle Great Society liberalism. Maybe you could argue there was not much redeemable about it in the first place because of things like Vietnam, or you could argue that Nixon was
we
just
kept that anyways, so it's
exactly
not like
Nixon enabled it.
That's the one side of it that they were like more than comfortable with keeping around.
Pretty much, yeah. But it's like I'd say that Clarence Thomas and like that Ayn Randist, almost like libertarian individualist right perspective that came up with H.W. Bush, who really was a ghoul of the foreign policy state, with Reagan, who was like the avatar of American libertarianism and individualism. These are the people who were actively involved in tearing up the Great Society model and ideology. And you see that with the dismantling of social support services, with a renewed interest in ratcheting up contradictions with views on race, sex, and identity. And just everything that we kind of deem, to be problematic in the current age, I think is a echo of that cataclysm. And I'm not here to defend LBJ and JFK, but to put things very simply, that was the vibe shift that I think we're living in the wake of. And Clarence Thomas is one of the people who enabled that. And his influence is long. It is tied to the class interests that may have enabled and supported those changes. And these vibe shifts are not accidental. They are not errors of history. These are concerted efforts. We do have class solidarity, as you mentioned. And it's the upper classes that are more aligned and organized in our country.
Yeah, I mean that really is probably the kind of the best way to sort of synthesize all of that, right? Is it's this the moment has sort of been defined within this like kind of neoconservative lens, and a lot of that is kind of it's the Randist. Clarence Thomas doesn't necessarily get all the credit or discredit that he deserves. I think he was always kind of his own willful silence on a lot of things. I think always kind of got him overshadowed by Scalia, or even some of his more modern contemporaries like Alito and Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and whatnot. They're all kind of animals of the same ilk, cut from this same cloth that's relatively corrupted. I mean, it's whether or not it's you actually buy that, like, oh, there was real influence had here. It's kind of inconsequential, right? This is basically just this is how it works. You get rewarded for helping fuel a corrupt system, which I would argue is just as bad as deliberately corrupting parts of it.
100%. And I think, like, we're kind of tying back to like when we did start the podcast, and like I think the first time I had you on was to maybe talk about like why is there this allergy to diagnosing issues of power and structure in the United States. And we are once again in like another incident of that, where we're clearly seeing something that contradicts the usual gut instinct to.
Well, and I think too, like there's somewhat of a risk too in focusing just on Thomas for some people, right? Where
Yeah.
he's a symptom, a pretty egregious symptom, right? I mean, you don't like let the growth just keep like protruding off your neck until it produces a second head. But he's a symptom of like the broader disease of how we evaluate power in this country and whatnot.
Yeah.
He's a particularly egregious example, but I think people like will he be impeached, as AOC is called for and whatnot, and I've maybe some others might have noted this as well. I think it's highly unlikely, right? I mean, obviously Republicans control the House anyways, where that process would start. They're not going to go along with it, but I also just don't think enough Democrats would go along with it either, because it's again sort of. I often joke just when it comes to like almost everything in this country, right? It's it's wrong to point to criticize, but it's not wrong to do the thing that's being criticized, right? You can be racist, but to call someone racist is an egregious like affront to them, right? You can do whatever horrible misdeed is supposedly unleash the woke brigade to cancel you. That's fine, but like to actually call for someone to be canceled is not.
To sexually assault, it doesn't get you in trouble, but
right.
To be charged with it is a
to be accused of it, to be charged with it, whatever. Like that's the problem, and that's just kind of this ongoing like just the like most frustrating thing. Really about like just like living in the society sometimes is just the weird civil adherence to that idea.
I mean, to quote the Joker, we live in a society.
We sure do.
I think you're spot on though. Like that is like I think when people talk about political correctness, the meanings of words are lost from when they first appeared in the vernacular. And I find that like as these discourses proceed and we have these attitudes as well as these institutions in which we discuss politics in America, meaning is one of these things that just gets lost with every sentence. And intellectual rigor, moral consistency are kind of secondary to this fundamental idea that you don't rock the boat. And that's what I really think is meant by political correctness. It's not about being woke, as some would say it was. Political correctness.
Well, they've been riding the train of like anti-political correctness well before.
Since the 70s, I would say, right?
Yeah.
Like since the 70s. But like what politically correct like meant back in the day is how do you say this without starting a ruckus?
Yeah.
And those are the contours in which we navigate. You're not allowed to really make a ruckus. You don't call the system into question. You don't discuss contradiction. The order as is just. It's these individual incidents that are mistakes more than anything. They're not endemic. They're not symptomatic of a broader symptom. They're not part of a larger whole, and that's. I don't know. I don't want to be moralistic or egregious here, but it's a diseased way of thinking that seems to dominate the minds of American political media and
Well,
I'd
and
say our
and
leaders.
two, like that, everything that you just described has been so appropriated by, kind of the anti woke side, right? Where it's like, well, we are trying to raise a ruckus and criticize the power structure, but like to them, the power structure is that like some trans folks exist, that like drag shows are like a thing that happens and stuff like that, and like just like such a perverse understanding of the power structure and like acting like that's really like bringing truth to power when it's just going after people who are themselves just as if not more powerless than you. That's the stuff that like kind of like really like in addition to just like on top of the diseased way of thinking that we don't really like look into that more deeply, but the fact that it's been appropriated to be used in a really destructive way is also really problematic.
100%. Couldn't have said it better myself. I guess final, I had an additional point about maybe we could talk about like just the ways in which rich people gather in secret and there is influence on the court through other things like the broader Catholic movement and to the far right, but I think we've kind of beat this horse. I guess final takes is, do you think this is going to result in anything for Clarence Thomas, or is this another thing he skates with?
I think he skates with it. The silver lining I can see is that maybe we might get this might just like be again it's like another in a long list of pretty recent episodes of people being pissed at the Supreme Court and the judicial system more generally, and maybe that leads to a more serious reckoning with how do we evaluate the role of these anti-democratic institutions, right? I think that some people argue, I mean, like the court like does the right thing sometimes because it's not democratic. But I think that those days, I mean, we're really looking at a brief window in the 60s, really, predominantly 50s and 60s, and after that, it's kind of gone.
Once again, the window was the Great Society liberal era.
Yeah, I mean, like a little bit before that, because you did have some of in his own words, Eisenhower's mistakes on the court that had made some pretty big liberal changes and whatnot through the court's body. But even then, right, even when the court has done like the right thing in like the case like Brown v. Board, it doesn't, it's without the democratic consult and without the the consent of the democratic institutions, it's sort of hard to enforce. The problem that we've gotten now is that like the liberals, in terms of like how we can conceive of the institutional Democratic Party, is just so kind of just obsessed with the process that they couldn't fathom doing anything that would slightly upset the way that things are traditionally conceived of being done. They're just so subsumed in that civic religion that I just don't think that they're willing to like do anything meaningful. But there's I mean, I'm hopeful for younger generations getting their way up there who are a little less like subservient to that. I'm hopeful that voters kind of see this and like, again, not saying that like, just vote your way out of horrible decisions made by lifetime appointees, because that's obviously not going to work directly. But if you can at least sort of reclaim the reins of power, or claim the reins in that maybe your group has never really had, I think that's the stuff that can maybe be the silver lining out of all of this.
I think that's spot on, right? Because I think what we've criticized the Democratic Party and its leadership for is a misunderstanding of what politics intends to accomplish, or maybe this is intentional, and discerning the difference may not matter, right? But
Sure.
what the American right understands is you want something done, you got to get it done. You get the numbers, you organize, you somewhat egregiously, push things through the system that it may not be equipped for. But to accomplish a goal, you got to work at it. And I think the Democratic Party, whether intentionally or unintentionally, has put the preservation of institutions and their norms above a political project.
Yeah.
So that's the task for the left is, like, how do we I think with the left it's more of there is a project, and if there isn't one, it can be obtained through organizing. Can the Democratic Party be the instrument by which those goals are accomplished? That's kind of what I see organizations like DSA and other like electoral efforts trying to do. Is it necessarily the way forward? It's one of the legal ways forward. One of the other ones that is legal technically is, union organizing. I'm not going to be one of those people who gets on a podcast and say we need a general strike and a revolution today. You can't do that without conditions being at a certain point. I'm not going to tell people to
Or
get in
without
trouble.
clear demands either.
Exactly. And I think like that's kind of where we're at, where it's like what the right once again, we do have class politics, and these are prescribed by the right. They are organized as a class, and they do, they are engaged in class warfare against the working class. What's the way out of the rut? That remains to be determined. I'm not even close to beginning to answer that question, but I think what we've done in this episode, and I think what we will continue to do with this show, and what we've done a good job of, because I'm proud of our past work, is deciphering these tea leaves for you and understanding how they distort coming to these observations. That is the greenhouse that we're gaslit in, to say the least.
He said the line.
He said it. Still can't believe that that moment in Star Wars where Palpatine said, "Yep, I'm the Phantom Menace." Oh God. Well, I guess I don't know. We've definitely beat this unusually threadbare outline on my part on this episode. Is there anything else that I think that you think might be worth mentioning, or something to maybe tie things more elegantly?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess, just kind of in sum, right? If you skip to the ends, Clarence Thomas is a diseased individual who, one way or another, is influenced either through his, acculturation with people like Harlan Crow and, whatever that means, whether he's, like how conservative he is, considering he's like buying Nazi memorabilia and, proudly displaying it in his collection. I think, whether or not he's being, bought or just kind of influenced through just, being his peer and being someone who, regularly socializes with him, I think either is problematic. You should be concerned about that, but know that he's a symptom of a much broader and nastier disease.
I think that's spot on. I guess I'll cite some of the articles in the episode description, and I'm once again speechless. This is just one of those ones where I'm like, "Yep, I mean, we've been saying it for what will now be 68 or so episodes that the system's diseased, but it will manifest in ways that you were not even familiar with, that you could have been familiar with." And that's where I'm at today. But silver lining is we're back. The show's back. In addition to shows, Josh, do you want to plug MonsterPop?
Sure, yeah, I'm also part of the MonsterPop podcast. It is a pro wrestling podcast where we cover, obviously, pro wrestling news, occasionally the political connections that sometimes emerge within that field as well. As we discussed last episode, technically, Donald Trump himself is a WWE Hall of Famer. Whether or not that's deserved or not is, entirely up for debate. But yeah, so I'm on there. You can follow us at MonsterPop Pod on Twitter and other. Listen to that also wherever you can listen to podcast.
Solid. I'll have the links to all our social media in the description below. You can follow us for updates on Twitter at @PodGreenhouse. Send us a DM. Send us a comment. How are we doing?
If we get enough questions, we'll do a mailbag episode.
We could do a mailbag episode. Seriously. We're always, we would like to make more content. We're just, it's really my fault. I'm lazy. That's really it.
Don't listen. Adi lives to feed the content machine.
Me, I hate feeding the content. A guy who feeds the content machine. Dear God. So yeah, that's where you can find all our stuff, and we'll see you around next time, dear listeners. Thanks for tuning in. Take care.